Hello boys and girls, welcome back. Well, Mr Mousey and Mr Rabbit have flown out of the pirate ship in the middle of a fight and have landed in this new place wherever they are. And of course Mr Rabbit, the first thing he says is he's hungry. Well, let's find out what happens next. Chapter 16 on Descalador. The fight and flight had taken its toll on both the woodland animals. Mr Rabbit was right, of course. Food would have to be a priority before they went much further. The question was, what to eat? Where they had landed in this foreign land was pleasant enough, but there was nothing very obvious about that looked like anything edible. Mr Mousey got up and looked about. 30 or so feet away he spied a bush with some kind of fruit on it, but when he went over to investigate, it turned out to be juniper. Edible, barely, but bitter and probably not very nutritious. Nonetheless, he picked some of the purple berries and headed back to the carpet. His eyes opened wide in wonderment when he saw his friend. Where did you go?" asked Mr Rabbit, his mouth stuffed with what Mr Mousey assumed to be the bite from a sandwich. From the massive slab of filled bread in his hand, it was an easy guess. Where did you get that?" exclaimed Mr Mousey. It looks fresh." "Yep, it is," mumbled the rabbit. "Lobster and pickle. One of my favourites." "Yes, but where did you find it?" Mr Mousey was perplexed. He hadn't noticed any lobster and pickle sandwich shops near at hand. "In my pack, of course. I see you threw out most of my old stuff. I suppose it had gone off, eh?" He seemed a very content rabbit indeed. Sure enough, Mr Rabbit's pack seemed as large as ever. Well, Mr Mousey hadn't had time to notice, what with the excitement of leaving the ship. As the rabbit munched away, the mouse looked into his own pack. It was full of food. There were sausages, buns, apples, pancakes, in fact, a whole larder full of Mr Mousey's favourite things. "You know, I didn't do this," he said, half to Mr Rabbit, half to himself. Well, Mr Rabbit paid him no attention. He was humming to himself as he stuck another lobster and pickle sandwich into his already rather full mouth. As he went through the contents of his pack, a piece of paper fell onto the grass. Picking it up, Mr Mousey saw that it was a letter. "Dear Mr Mousey," it began in a flowing script, "I took the liberty of having your bags restocked. There may come a time when you may need them at a moment's notice. I wish you and Mr Rabbit every success where others have failed. The hope of many may rest on small, but I grow to believe, able shoulders. Your servant in His Majesty's service." It was signed with a flourish. "The captain of HMS Redoubtable." Below that was a PS. "Perhaps we can none of us appear to be what we seem." Mr Mousey tried to put together his picture of the rat captain in his rather elegant note. It didn't seem to work, and yet, if not the rat captain, who else? "Did you notice anything odd about the rat captain?" he asked the still humming and munching rabbit. He said, swallowing his mouthful. "You mean, beside the fact that a rat in charge of a big piece of expensive boat is pretty odd?" "No, I mean," added the mouse, "anything about him seemed, well, not what it seemed, if you know what I mean." His friend set down the bun he was halfway through and looked at Mr Mousey as if not quite getting the gist of the question. "Well, there was his nose," he replied at last. "His nose? Yes, his nose. I mean to say, where did you ever see a snout that length? If you ask me, that was a rubber nose. A stuck-on rubber nose. He gave a single abrupt nod as if to show his great detective abilities were obvious to all. Mr. Mousey opened his mouth to speak, but heard instead Mr. Rabbit continuing on. You see, that's why he spoke so funny. Could you speak properly with a rubber conch stuck on the front? Well, it was not a conversation that Mr. Mousey imagined had much of a sensible future, so instead he showed his friend the letter. You see, I just found this in my pack. I think it was written by the captain. I also think it was he who prepared our packs, or had them prepared. Mr. Rabbit looked up at his friend, then down at the letter. After reading it, he looked up at his friend again, a puzzled look on his face. But how could he know? Did you hear what he said as he helped us escape? Well, not really. I was sort of being deafened by a very loud thump, thump. I think it was probably my heart. Mr. Mousey smiled. Well, my heart was beating like a drum too, but he looked at me and said, "Take the chart on the table." But wasn't that just him being helpful? Asked the rabbit. Yes, but take it and go where? Besides, then he said, it has more detail than thy book. I had hidden the book. No one else knew where it was. Mr. Rabbit shook his head and gave it a scratch. Mr. Mousey continued, I think he knew about the carpet, where we were going, everything. This statement resulted in the two of them sitting and looking at one another in silent thought for some minutes. At last, Mr. Rabbit spoke. Well, if he had known where we were going, I wish he had told us. Well, as it was, Mr. Rabbit's comment had hit the nail pretty much on the head. Neither of the two of them had any idea yet as to where they were supposed to be heading. They both felt as if they were being drawn somehow to help someone in need. Mr. Mousey couldn't get the picture of the sad princess out of his head, but it was all very vague. Well, we can at least find out where we are now, said the little mouse, remembering the chart he had brought from the ship. Unfolding the map, he lay out flat on the short grass before him. It was a finely detailed map, mainly of the sea they had flown over and sailed over in the previous days, but to the bottom was a large area of land that carried on down to the bottom of the paper. It was to this area that he turned his attention. Do you want the good news or the bad news? He asked his pal. Good news, the rabbit answered back surprisingly quickly. The good news is Mr. Mousey paused for a moment. Wouldn't you like to hear the bad news first? Oh, great, said Mr. Rabbit, flopping backwards to lean on his two arms stretched behind himself. What you mean is there only is bad news. Well, badish. Mr. Mousey decided just to get on with it. We are in Descalador. Descalador? As in, we're those mad nutters who want to chop our heads from in Descalador? Mr. Mousey was chewing at the chart. I think we must be about here somewhere. He pointed at a part of the coast on the western bank of the deep loch protruding south into the land. It's much better detail than was in the book. Oh, is there a map in the book? Asked the rabbit, who had not seen the book in some time and had not seen the map in it at all. Goodness, I forgot you wouldn't have seen that. Here, take a look. He passed the satchel from out of his pack over to his friend. Mr. Rabbit pulled out the large red book and began to flick through its pages. About a third of the way through he stopped and appeared to study something on the page. No, not there, said Mr. Mousey. You'll find it in the middle of the book. Mr. Rabbit continued to look at the page he was at. "Have you seen this?" he asked. His friend peered over and saw that the rabbit was at chapter 5, the Silvery Sea. The book had done it again. The last time they had read the book, it ended mid-sentence, but now the pages were filled with writing. To the southwest they sped, seeking out sign of the land across the sea, the land where next their journey lay. Much was yet to befall them: the fall from the carpet, the rescue from the sea. On board the ship of the fallen king, they learned how to fight, a skill that was too soon to be needed. Were it not for the bravery of the king's men and the courage of the heroes themselves, however, the mission may have finished far short of its goal. Well has the song been sung: a flashing steel from gallant men, a flame of hope still burning bright, when two shall from their peril flee, to seek and save, to bear the light deep into where the danger broods, the darkest fear, the dragon woods. Mr. Rabbit gulped. "There's a lot of stuff in there that makes my whiskers stick out." Sure enough, his whiskers looked remarkably spiky indeed. He looked like he was chewing on a fistful of chopsticks. "Is it really about us? Some of those things make no sense to me at all." Mr. Mousey couldn't say he understood it all either, but more questions than answers were in those eerie words. Just reading the poem made his hair stand on end. The book had more to say though. And so they found themselves on the shores of a strange and foreign land. Before them lay the path into the forest. Care was to be taken lest they be caught on its trail, and every piece of cunning had to be brought to bear in keeping their progress concealed from enemy eyes. In furtive steps and silent nights they moved like shadows, faces grey, to rescue one whose hope grew dim. None but these friends from woods away had come this far, had not turned back. Descalador, they dared attack. Mr. Mousey, who was now holding the book in both hands, thumbed over the heavy parchment page and came to another chapter, chapter 6, the Forest of Darkness. Again, words that had definitely not been there before filled the right-hand page. The left was taken up with a beautifully detailed illustration. It was a picture of a vast forest, painted from a bird's eye view. Stretching deep into the picture, trees covered a vast plain. A sliver of silver could be seen off to the east, a river probably. And in the centre of the picture, a narrow trail could be seen, disappearing into the dense growth. The trees were a mixture: pine-like trees, oak, others that Mr. Mousey guessed might be gum or eucalyptus. What there was not, however, was any open space, just tightly packed forest. Apart from one thing, away in the distance a stone tower could just be made out. How far away was hard to estimate, since there was no way of knowing how large or how small the tower was, but it was many miles. That much could be clearly seen. The text on the opposite page concerned the route through the forest. Apparently there was one near to where they were at present, which was just as well, since there were warnings everywhere about venturing in and getting lost without trace. Green moss, roots and bark, ferny leaves delves deep and dark. Paths appear and fade like wisp, sudden silence, seas of mist, and all about the hidden eyes, the sound of fear, the dragon cries. Mr. Mousey felt that more mention of dragons was probably more than his friend was ready for, especially now as night was closing in, so he decided not to read out aloud that part. Actually, night was falling remarkably quickly and they had no shelter. It's getting dark very quickly, isn't it? Asked the slightly shaky voice of Mr. Rabbit. I think it's because we've come so far south, said Mr. Mousey. The sun goes down faster. We'd be as well finding somewhere for the night. What, like a guest house? Even if there was one in this place, you'd have to drag me into it. Mr. Mousey laughed quietly. No, I mean like under a bush somewhere. I have a canvas cover and there's the carpet. Come on. With that they got up and prowled about looking for a suitable spot for the night. Unless the temperature dropped an awful lot during the night, it seemed as if they were going to be warm enough. What about here? Mr. Rabbit had found a few of the shrubby plants growing together, forming a cover over a dry, leafy undergrowth. It looked as if it would do just fine, so the mouse and the rabbit crawled underneath. They dragged their packs in behind them, and making a ground sheet out of the canvas cover, pulled the rug over themselves. To the world outside and the stars in the heavens, they were completely invisible and utterly undetectable, and very soon fast asleep. Well, that's the end of that chapter. Looks like they have a big forest journey to make ahead, but we'll find that out in the next chapter. In the meantime, you look after yourselves and be careful, and God bless. Bye bye, boys and girls.